It's one of the biggest unanswered questions about the COVID-19 pandemic. How did it begin? We do know that the epicenter of the initial outbreak was in Wuhan, China, in late 2019. However, was the global outbreak sparked by a spillover of the coronavirus from animals to humans, as the conventional wisdom has long suggested? Or did the virus escape from a lab in China that studies viruses? Sharri Markson is author of What Really Happened in Wuhan. It's published by HarperCollins. Sharri is investigations editor at the Australian newspaper. Her Sky News documentary on Wuhan that went to air on YouTube about 3 weeks ago has attracted 6 million views. 6 million views on YouTube for any organisation is truly mind-boggling, absolutely. 6 million views. And with that, it's a great pleasure to welcome Sharri Markson.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you so much, Tom, for the very generous introduction and for your support when writing the book. Tom very kindly introduced me to some crucial players. He was the person who connected me with the right people so that I could interview the former Secretary of State and former CIA Director, Mike Pompeo, who I first interviewed for my book and then again a few months later for the documentary. So Tom was extremely generous and helpful during this process, and I'm so grateful for that. Now, this is without question the most fascinating, intriguing, and complicated story I have ever covered. And when I first started writing about this in March and April last year, I never could have guessed that I'd be writing an entire book. I never thought I'd write a book. I didn't want to be an author, let alone make a documentary and dedicate the majority of my life to this topic. And I started it just like any journalist starts looking into a story. You know, I got a tip from a contact that the intelligence agencies were investigating whether the virus was a lab leak. That was in March last year. And I kept inquiring and reaching out to more contacts, and that eventually led to a front page story in late April that the Five Eyes intelligence network was investigating whether COVID-19 had leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That story went global. And we know now that there was nothing controversial about that story. That was accurate at the time, and it remains accurate. We know, Joe Biden has asked the intelligence agencies this year to investigate the origins of the virus, and the agencies remained split. So my story was simply reporting that they were looking into this. But at the time, from the moment I started reporting on this, there was immense media pushback. And I'm sure I'm going to talk to Tom about that in a moment when we're in conversation. But it was treated as a conspiracy. And this was just absurd to me because as I kept looking into the story and all the parts started unraveling, and there was so much to the story, that it was either the more likely scenario, or at least it was very plausible, and there was nothing about the suggestion that it could have leaked from a lab that was a conspiracy. The very first thing that told me that was that the main laboratory in Wuhan was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, and that housed the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses. It had also been engaging in what you've probably now heard the term gain-of-function research, and especially if you've read the book, you know all about it. But gain-of-function research is basically research where a virus will gain a new function, like the ability to infect humans when it couldn't do that before, or maybe the ability to become airborne, transmissible through the air. It often involves making a virus more lethal and more virulent, more transmissible, more dangerous. Now, this has been a topic of heated scientific debate going back some 10 or 12 years. as I would discover. I didn't know any of this at the beginning. And it's been fascinating because the scientific community was split on this, and there was a whole group set up called the Cambridge Working Group, which objected to this type of research and campaigned that it should be banned. And it worked. The Obama administration did ban gain-of-function research in 2014 in 22 fields. Technically, they put a pause on the research in 22 fields, including in coronaviruses. Yet even when this risky research was stopped in the United States, what happened, which is so disgraceful, is that American funding continued to flow to China for this research that was deemed too risky for the United States. It was flowing to China, and this research was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, in part funded by America. And I found one interview that Anthony Fauci, and he's the head of NIAID, the top coronavirus advisor to the president. And he said that the research was being funded in China to avoid an outbreak, and these are his words, in Hoboken, New Jersey, or Fairfax, Virginia. And we know that's crazy. If there's an outbreak in China, there can be an outbreak in every single pocket of the earth, which is potentially what we've seen in this pandemic. And of course, we don't have the definitive answers, but this is where, in my view, and the cases in the book, the overwhelming evidence is pointing. So that America was funding this research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And it was so risky. They were taking viruses and combining different genetic sequences from different viruses into a new virus or onto a backbone of a pre-existing virus that originally came from nature. They were putting in new spike proteins, which is what makes the virus so infectious to humans. And as Professor Petrovsky, you might have heard of Nikolai Petrovsky, he's really a crucial player in this whole story. He's a vaccine developer based in Adelaide, and he decided to develop a vaccine for COVID-19 when the pandemic first broke out. And he conducted some scientific experiments, computer simulations, to try and determine the intermediary animal host. He didn't even for a moment think this wasn't a natural virus. And he thought it was important to determine the intermediary animal host to work out how the virus crossed from an infected animal to a human. And this was important in order to develop a vaccine. But what he found was that the virus was better adapted to infect humans than any other animal, any other mammal, including bats. And what Petrovsky says is that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, it can't infect bats. That's just mind-blowing. So what he found, to get into the specifics of the science, is that the spike protein of SARS-CoV-2 was almost perfectly adapted to the human ACE2 receptor, which is how COVID-19 enters our body. So this was a mind-blowing finding, and he knew it was so extraordinary. He wrote up a paper with his colleagues at La Trobe University, and no scientific journal would publish it. No one would touch it. Not only that, but there is preprint servers or prepress servers. The very idea of a preprint server is to publish science before it's had the chance to be peer reviewed. And yet even the preprint servers wouldn't publish his paper. And you might think, well, they were being careful. However, at the same time, they were publishing science that wasn't credible, that wasn't rigorous, that amounted to opinions in the most prestigious scientific and medical journals in the world, Nature and The Lancet. They were publishing what amounted to opinion pieces by the likes of scientists like Peter Daszak. So the letter in The Lancet that was published in February last year said that it was a conspiracy to suggest that the virus might have had a laboratory origin. It was really strongly worded. And there were 27 scientists who put their name to that letter. So the majority of people in the media and in the public, I mean, we all trust the scientific community. Why wouldn't we? And so we believed that, well, if they're saying the most distinguished scientists in the most distinguished medical journal are saying this is a conspiracy, a lab leak is a conspiracy, and this is almost certainly a natural virus, why wouldn't we all believe them? It wasn't until November last year, November 2020, that a not-for-profit organization in the United States called the US Right to Know Group, they obtained a batch of FOI documents, Freedom of Information documents. They were emails. And in the emails, it emerged that it was Peter Daszak who had drafted the letter that ran in the Lancet, and that he had organized, he had approached all these other scientists to sign it. Now, Peter Daszak had been working with and funding the Wuhan Institute of Virology for 15 years. He'd had a sub-grant from the NIH, and that sub-grant was going to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. He's friends with Xi Zhengli. They do karaoke together. And yet he was behind this letter that said this was a conspiracy and there was no conflict of interest declaration at the end at all, nothing. It was left to a Freedom of Information request from the Right to Know Group, the US Right to Know Group, to actually uncover this extraordinary conflict of interest. And I had Gary Ruskin on my Sky News show the moment I saw this, and you'd think this would be massive news around the world, but barely anyone else covered it. The US media pretty much ignored it completely. What was then worse is that just a couple of months later, the World Health Organization sent its team into Wuhan to conduct an inquiry into the origins of COVID-19. And the United States put forward 3 officials that it thought would be qualified to be part of this team. And I named those 3 people in the book. They were rejected. And instead, a name that they didn't put forward was selected, Peter Daszak. And so he and the book details many other conflicts of interest among the investigative team on behalf of the WHO. So they went into Wuhan to investigate how this virus began. They went to the Wuhan Institute of Virology as part of that 2-week trip, but they just spent 3 hours there. Now, in my opinion, one of the most crucial pieces of evidence that would help us determine definitively where the virus came from is the Wuhan Institute of Virology's virus database. It has the details of some 22,000 coronaviruses. It was mysteriously taken offline by the laboratory on the 12th of September, 2019, and it has never been made available to anyone trying to investigate this issue. The WHO team did not even ask to see that virus database. That's an admission that Peter Daszak has made on camera, on the record. Did not even ask to see the virus database. It included unpublished viruses, because some people say, well, we know what work they were doing. Well, it had a section on unpublished viruses. So the whole inquiry was a farce to begin with. And this isn't just my opinion. On the day it was released, even the Director General, Dr. Tedros, he said the possibility of a laboratory leak wasn't investigated properly and there needs to be another investigation. He said that on the day that his own report was handed down. But it was when there was the preliminary press conference of the WHO on the 10th of February this year. They just concluded their trip, and they held a press conference, and they said that their findings were that a laboratory leak was extremely unlikely, and they even rated the possibility of the virus being imported by frozen food as more likely than that. And that was the day I knew I had to write a book on this. I had been trusting that the officials would actually take this seriously and investigate this possibility. But yet there was this unique situation where the officials weren't investigating it. The World Health Organization, who we trust to look into the origins of pandemics, weren't doing it. The media was still saying it was a conspiracy. And so I decided then and there to write a book and pull all of this together, because there's so much, and there was so much to uncover. You know, the scientists, not just Petrovsky, but many others who have looked at the features of SARS-CoV-2 and said that it could be laboratory manipulated. The furin cleavage site is one aspect of the virus that they say is so unusual. And again, you know, when I started looking into this, the official line was, well, there's no evidence in the virus of lab manipulation. And that was very confusing to me. I don't, you know, have no background in science. But it was only later that I understood that actually modern techniques, you can manipulate a virus without a trace. It's called the no-seum technique, which was developed by Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina. And he had taught it to Shi Zheng Li at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. So there was so much to unpick, and you know, the gain of function that was happening at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. That is something that Fauci has denied strongly for a long time. You would have seen him sitting in hearings in the United States being grilled. The most famous clip is of him being grilled by Republican Rand Paul. And he says to Rand Paul, you do not know what you're talking about. And when I was giving media interviews on this topic, I felt confident enough to say, Fauci is lying, because I'd read the scientific papers that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was producing. It is there in black and white at the bottom, funded with grants from the NIH or other agencies. And it was clearly, some of them were clearly gain-of-function research. And I was interviewing, saying to multiple scientists, is this gain-of-function? And you could see what they were doing, even me. I could see what they were doing with the spike protein and the different viruses. So it was obvious to me that he was lying. But it was only in the past week, and you might have seen the news on this, that the NIH put out a formal letter correcting the record to say that, in fact, that NIH and the NIAID had funded gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Something I've been reporting on the front page of The Australian, as you've read, for months and months and months, and they corrected the record this week. So what you're ultimately looking at, and by the way, you know, Fauci has become a politically divisive figure, but in fact, he has been a long advocate of gain-of-function research. I found a 2012 paper he wrote when the debate was happening about whether or not to ban gain-of-function research, and he wrote this paper supporting a voluntary ban, but ultimately he argued in the paper that the risks of gain-of-function research, he said the risks were that it could cause a pandemic, but he argued those risks were worth the benefits of it. So he has been a long supporter of this type of research. And yet he is still the top medical advisor on the coronavirus to the president, and there's been no proper investigation, no proper inquiry. The second WHO inquiry that's just been announced, many of the people who took part in the first one are on the second inquiry as well. So there's no evidence. Peter Daszak isn't, but many of the other conflicted scientists are also on this inquiry. So, you know, we're at a really difficult point in time when this virus has killed nearly 5 million people, or about 5 million people around the world. It has ruined untold number of businesses, decimated economies, upended all of our lives. But there just doesn't seem to be this international appetite to have a rigorous inquiry where you actually subpoena the documents to see what was going on, because it's not just about China not being transparent. There's a lot of people and agencies in the West who do have information, who were working in conjunction with the laboratory, who do have records and emails that would help us shed a lot of light on what research was being done. And I think ultimately we could end up with a scenario where the virus leaked from a laboratory that was being in part funded by American agencies, and where Australia trained the scientists. And I think that is the position that we might end up getting to, and it might take a while, but I strongly believe we will have definitive answers on this. There's more information coming out every day. And even just me, one person, I was able to uncover so much, speak to whistleblowers in Wuhan, speak to Chinese dissidents who are now based in the West, and I don't even have subpoena powers. So I think if there was the international will to get to the bottom of this, we would be able to. And we saw it's not impossible. We saw with the downing of flight MH17, that's another authoritarian regime, Russia, but we were able to have an international inquiry. We were able to hold Russia to account and get to the truth. And I think we absolutely can in this situation as well. One final point before I move to in conversation with Tom, because I think my time's almost up. A lot of people say, oh, well, there's no evidence for a lab leak. But what I found while looking into this topic in some detail and interviewing intelligence officials, politicians, former heads of intelligence agencies, scientists, open source researchers, and whistleblowers as well, is that there's actually a lot of evidence, overwhelming evidence, that there was an incident at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, both by examining the virus itself, the research they were doing at the lab, and the unusual activity that unfolded at that laboratory in that window for an outbreak, September, October, November 2019. There's enormous evidence. It's beyond overwhelming. And yet there's no evidence that the virus emerged naturally from human contact with an infected animal. No evidence for that at all. The only reason people think that is the most likely scenario is that is how other outbreaks, other pandemics have started in the past. Thank you.
Sharri, thank you very much. Just to set the scene here, in our last real event before we all went into lockdown in March of last year was at the Chifley Tower, and the subject was, is the coronavirus likely to be Communist China's Chernobyl moment? And we had a panel discussion, excellently moderated by my colleague Salvatore Babones. We had a lively exchange of views about this question. And this was February 19 last year. And no one on the panel, no one in the audience asked the question, could it be that this coronavirus that was at this stage pretty much confined to Northeast Asia, certainly China, but also Japan and South Korea, and I think early stages of infections in Iran, of all places. But no one seriously raised the prospect that this coronavirus could infect the rest of the world beyond Northeast Asia and trigger a global economic downturn. No one asked that question. It's fascinating. And yet within weeks, as we all know, the world was upended and we went into lockdown. Now, take us back to March 12 of 2020, March 12 last year. You texted a trusted source in the Australian Foreign Intelligence Agency. Tell us more.
So I texted a contact tapped into that community or tapped into that agency who and asked him if it's possible that this was a laboratory leak in Wuhan, or whether that is correct. It's just a conspiracy theory. And he replied to tell me that it was something that was being investigated, whether it came from a Wuhan laboratory, and he gave some other detail. I quote part of that text message in my book. And I found the response very perplexing because this was being treated as a conspiracy. But so it opened my mind to then inquire into this a bit more. And at the time I was political editor-at-large at the Daily Telegraph. I had a 1-year-old, so I was coming up to the end of my maternity leave. So I was still writing political columns for the Telegraph. And so I made inquiries and found out that there was advice to the Morrison government that this might have been a lab leak, which was initially at a 50% chance early on, and that was later watered down to 5%. And now, as we know, the intelligence community is divided and split on the issue, and some think it's more likely. Some of the US intelligence agencies think it's a more likely scenario and others don't. But none have any view. None hold a high degree of confidence in any of their opinions, which shows, just how little information they have. So that really put me on the path to have an open mind and take it seriously. And it led, some 6 weeks later to my first big front page story on it.
Dates are important because I mentioned February of last year.
Yes.
It wasn't just CIS, it was the whole mainstream media, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, PBS, the BBC, the London Telegraph, the London Times, the Guardian, the Australian. No one was seriously thinking that this could infect the rest of the world. But also in March, mid-March, when you're making these inquiries, no one seriously contemplated the idea that this could come out of a lab.
No.
But you had the scoop at the Australian a month later. Tell us about that scoop. What did you actually report?
Well, that was at the Daily Telegraph.
Was it the Telegraph?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So April of last year.
Yeah. So that was a big the first front page story was that the Five Eyes Intelligence Network are examining whether COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And then in the same story, I detailed how the scientists Xi Zhengli and her number 2, Peng Zhu, had either worked or been trained in Australia at the CSIRO a decade earlier.
Now, when did the President, Donald Trump, and the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, when did they start publicly airing their doubts about the narrative on the...
So this was fascinating, right? Because a lot of people think, it was deemed a conspiracy because Trump said it, right? But in fact, Trump didn't say anything about a lab leak until April. And this is something my book details, and I'm actually very critical of the Trump administration in the early days because they were praising China. They were praising the Communist Party for being transparent, praising Xi Jinping for being transparent, for sharing news about the outbreak. And the complete opposite was the case. And so it was very misleading for the world to think, Trump was literally tweeting saying, everything's under control, Xi Jinping is being transparent, he's a great friend, we're going to be fine. And at precisely that time that he was tweeting that, Pompeo couldn't get officials on the ground in Wuhan. They were being rejected at every level. And as Pompeo said to me, he compared it to the movie called The Sting, and they were getting the shutout. So it was this, unbelievable situation where from the very start there was a massive cover-up of the virus by the Chinese Communist Party. And it wasn't until late April, when a Fox News reporter said to Trump at a press conference, is there any evidence that the virus might have leaked from a lab? And Trump's remarks for him were quite understated. He said truthfully, yes, there is evidence. It wasn't even I quote it specifically in the book, but it wasn't even a big statement. But the media, picked on that. And the reason it had already been dubbed a conspiracy theory by that time was because of figures like Peter Daszak.
Dates are important. April of last year is also when the Foreign Minister, Maurice Payne, called for an international inquiry into the outbreak of Wuhan. Is there any evidence, as her critics say, that she was put in this position by Washington?
Yeah. So I asked that question of everyone when I was writing the book. And her international counterparts knew that she was going to be making that statement, that Australia was going to be calling for an inquiry, but no one asked Australia to do it as far as I could find out. So they were supportive. The Pompeo and his team liked the fact that Australia was going to be taking the lead on this. So it wouldn't be seen as a US versus China issue. It would be seen as a international free world versus tyranny type issue, in getting to the bottom of the virus rather than just an American-Australia issue. But when I asked the question of multiple sources, there was no direct request.
Now's as good a time as any is to say, a bit of self-promotion here, but 8 months earlier, CIS actually hosted an event at the New South Wales State Library with the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, and the Foreign Minister, and we're talking about the rise of China. Of course, so much happens in the next 8 months. Indeed. But China, of course, responded to her call for an international inquiry. We know the story. They imposed sanctions on various export sectors. Just before we move on, though, I think something really important that everyone has forgotten, including me until I read the interview she did with David Spears on Insiders that Sunday. Mm-hmm. She said the inquiry should not be held by the WHO. She said that would be like a bit of a poacher and gamekeeper scenario. She said that on the ABC. Right. And yet this is still the situation we're in, where the WHO, which is so compromised, so conflicted, Tedros is ridiculously beholden to China and owes his leadership to China. But the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, has to this day vigorously denied the lab scenario. And they often say the culprits came from beyond their borders. Came from
Fort Detrick, they say.
Where is the evidence that the CCP officials mishandled research and misinformed the public?
I mean, the cover-up is so extensive. I couldn't possibly go through it all now. I've got a chapter on it in the book, which is ironically titled Transparency. But the cover-up was so immense. It involved the Chinese communist regime literally disappearing people who tried to sound the alarm about the virus. Doctors, citizen journalists, activists, scientists disappeared, never to be seen again. People who were publicly trying to warn the world that there was a coronavirus spreading in Wuhan, or point the finger or raise questions about the Wuhan Institute of Virology. I mean, that to me is the most shocking. They disappeared people. But then they also destroyed virus samples, the earliest samples of the coronavirus that were being sent to laboratories for testing. The health authorities ordered them to be destroyed. And I think that was on the 1st or 2nd of January, the dates in the book. Very early on, ordered those samples to be destroyed. They gagged any scientists from speaking about the new coronavirus. They didn't ever share the genetic sequence. That was something that Eddie Holmes at the University of Sydney, he ended up sharing the genomic sequence of SARS-CoV-2. The Communist Party never shared it with the international community, and everyone was asking for that. They didn't share it. The cover-up was just
And you also talk about
massive.
Sharri, one of the key witnesses, disappearing, and then recently he emerges in a YouTube video and he says he can't talk about what's happened Tell that story.
Yeah, this was extraordinary. So one of the people... So when I was writing the book, I chose to name as many people as I could, but ultimately you can't tell in detail everybody's stories. So, one of the people I chose to do a bit of a deep dive on was a young lawyer called Cheng Quishi. And he caught the last train to Wuhan, and then he was uploading all these YouTube videos to tell the world about the virus. He was sneaking into hospitals, videoing how there were, dead people, bodies, and people sick, and that was overwhelming. Because at the time, remember, China was still denying there was human-to-human transmission of the virus, and underreporting all of its statistics, the death figures and infection figures. So he was uploading these YouTube videos, and he eventually got arrested and disappeared. So I chose to highlight his case while mentioning in a shorter way many of the others that were public. And I highlighted him in the book and then in the documentary that was based on the book that, as you say, has had nearly 6 million views.
Yep.
And the week that my book and documentary came out, this whistleblower who hadn't been seen since February last year, 600 days, he reappeared in the background of a friend's video.
Sure.
And he gave a comment saying, I can't talk about where I've been, but I'm okay. And disappeared once again, which again just shows how closely the communist regime is paying attention to Australia and our reporting, which obviously I know because they keep attacking me. that was just another example. And then I felt guilty. And then I was like, well, maybe I should have shone a light on all these other people as well. And maybe they...
I will test you in a moment, but before we get to that, tell us more about, you write about this in the current issue of the UK Spectator.
Yes.
The extent to which the CCP and its media affiliates go out of their way to denigrate and demonise you through their various platforms. Tell us more.
Yeah. It's not something I feel very comfortable talking about myself, but the Spectator asked me to write about this topic. I wouldn't have chosen to write about this. But,
it's an interesting story.
But the Chinese Communist Party propaganda outlets have done, dozens of stories and attacks on me personally, including a weird video that they shared with their 4.2 million followers.
Yeah, and 4.2 million followers.
Yeah. So it's, again, to me, that's a very strong indication of, yet again, of how, the proper, and I interviewed people about this, about how the Communist Party regime just was so determined to deflect any focus on the possibility of a lab leak. And what's so extraordinary is how this worked. For the first, 12, 14, 16 months of the pandemic, this was a conspiracy theory, right? Like the official narrative of the world's largest authoritarian regime was the main predominant narrative that took hold around the world, including in our media. How disgraceful is that? Yeah. And anyone who tried to question it, the scientists, not just Petrovsky, but others, were unable to publish their research in scientific journals. Journalists like me were humiliated or bullied. Anyone who was trying to look at this properly, was just dubbed a conspiracy theorist. How is it the case that the official narrative of the world's largest authoritarian regime was able to take hold at the expense of finding out the truth, of having a proper inquiry?
And you've been hacked too. You're not alone. I'll never forget in October 2019, Nicholas Burns, whom President Biden has just nominated to be the next US ambassador to the People's Republic of China, he was scheduled to give the Owen Harries, I mentioned Owen Harries before, he's a former CIS fellow, the Owen Harries annual lecture at the Lowy Institute in October of 2019. And Michael Fullilove, my opposite number at Lowy, invited me to have lunch with Nicholas Burns before he went on stage. And it's incredible. Burns was asked to talk about US-China policy. This is just before coronavirus.
Yeah.
And it was a hawkish speech. And he couldn't find it on his laptop. It just disappeared all of a sudden.
Wow.
And he said this had often happened when important material on his laptop, his Harvard University laptop, just disappeared. And he was absolutely convinced from intelligence agencies that it was a PRC hacking. So you're in good company. Burns.
Luckily I wasn't hacked, but there were various, there was nothing successful. There were various attempts.
Okay.
And including one, because luckily
how did you know it was the Chinese government though?
Well, because luckily one of my great contacts is a cybersecurity firm called Internet 2.0, the founders there. Yeah. And so I'd forward them a screenshot or an email and they'd say, well, this one was able to do a geo pinpoint of your location, but there's no tracking on it. So I'd be like,
Sharri, how would you respond to those who say China is its own worst enemy? This is Hamish MacDonald in the Guardian newspaper. This is not the Hamish MacDonald at the ABC's Radio National, where I also work.
This is the one who has the lowest ever Q&A ratings, and then to the project where he's had the lowest.
It's a different, that's right, but it's a different Hamish MacDonald. This is the former China correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
He's not the same one as the project. No, there's two of them. But the one who wrote this, is he the same one as the project?
No, it's a different guy.
It's a different guy.
Yeah,
really?
No, this guy's a lot older. Anyway, Hamish MacDonald in the Guardian.
Luckily you cleared that up. I would have had a lifelong vendetta against the wrong guy.
Hamish MacDonald.
Seriously. I was thinking this was a Lisa Wilkinson conspiracy.
The media has generally been pretty good about your book, but Hamish MacDonald, the other Hamish MacDonald, wrote a very critical review of your book in the Guardian newspaper of all places. But he says the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, puts secrecy around things no one can really blame them for, and even good things. Quote, it makes the CCP sitting ducks for critics such as Markson to put the worst possible interpretation on what they do. Sharri?
Yeah. I mean, the idea that the CCP would cover up even good things is a bit absurd. It is true, of course, that cover-ups and secrecy are hallmarks of communism and authoritarian regimes. There's no question about that. But the extent of the deliberate cover-up over COVID-19 is far above and beyond anything we've ever seen before. China never admitted to the world that there was a new coronavirus. It leaked out. The WHO found out about it and asked Chinese officials in Wuhan, and they involuntarily admitted it on New Year's Eve 2019. The cover-up we've seen is so extensive, so above and beyond anything else.
But the WHO will say that the WHO, when they've had their inquiries, say that the CCP has cooperated with them in the
they don't say that. They say that they were unable to get the data that they need. One of the things they've been asking for are blood bank samples from earlier in 2019, because that would show when the virus first started spreading, when there was community transmission. None of this has been made available. Even to the WHO was battling.
The last and only foreign scientist in the Wuhan lab is the Australian expert Danielle Anderson. Now, she worked with the Wuhan Institute of Virology on bat viruses, and she paints a very different picture of the Wuhan Institute to the one that you paint. She's now at Melbourne's Doherty Institute, and in an interview with the Bloomberg, which I'm sure you're familiar with, she spoke highly, and I'm reading this, of the professionalism in the high containment laboratory and of its director. According to Danielle Anderson, she can't recall the WIV staff coming down with COVID-19 in November of 2019, nor does she recall the cell phone network being shut down or road access being blocked off for several days in October 2019. So I suppose the question here is, how do you reconcile Danielle Anderson's reflections with your thesis?
Yeah, there's a few things to note here. Firstly, Danielle Anderson was working in the BSL-4 lab. Xi Zhengli was doing her coronavirus research in BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs. So they weren't in the same facility. And it's the research that was being conducted by Xi Zhengli's team, the gain-of-function research on coronaviruses, that is really the focus here, that this is really the type of research that might have led to the pandemic starting. So Danielle Anderson was in a different laboratory. Now, some of the scientists who signed that early Lancet letter that said this was a conspiracy, they later retracted their position because they didn't realize the coronavirus research was being done in BSL-2 and BSL-3 labs because it's lower levels of security protocols. Some have likened it to a dentist's office. I don't think that's exactly accurate, but some have likened it. Now, the second point is that even in the world's best laboratories, where, she talks about their professionalism, where you have, even in the best labs in the United States, there are lab accidents. They happen all the time. They are very common.
Smallpox came from lab leaks in England in the 60s and 70s.
I've got a whole chapter in the book on the number of accidents that have happened. It's literally all the time. It's why the Cambridge Working Group was arguing gain-of-function research should be banned because it can cause a pandemic. Just one last point on Danielle Anderson.
Yep.
Now, the Wuhan Institute of Virology the level 4 lab was built in conjunction with the French government. You guys might know that. But then from the moment it became operational, the French scientists were effectively no longer welcome. They were effectively kicked out of the lab, and that led to a lot of anger on the part of the French. And it led to concern among French intelligence about the type of research that they might have been intending to conduct at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. This is, again, documented. I've done interviews with people who said this. It's been reported elsewhere, but it's also documented in the cables that were sent back from Beijing to Washington in 2018. These were the cables that the Washington Post columnist Josh Rogin first reported in April last year. Now, those cables make it very clear, it says it, that there was basically no one from the international communities was welcome at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. They were rejecting the international cooperation. So this is again evidenced by the fact that Danielle Anderson says she was the only Western scientist at the lab. So you then have to ask the question, why was she allowed into the lab? And you have to, I don't know the answer to that, and you have to take that into account when you listen to what she says.
Okay, now it's time for questions. I'd like to open it up. First question, Tim.
2 questions very quickly. Did you feel under threat yourself personally? And then secondly, was it an accident or was it deliberate?
No, I don't feel under threat personally. I feel okay. I think it was an accident. I don't think it was deliberate. But obviously we don't know for sure, and everyone has a different opinion on that. But everyone I interviewed, except for Wei Jingsheng, everyone else I interviewed, even former President Trump, thought it was most likely an accident. I think the cover-up and the way they acted at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, the way everyone was kicked out of the facility for 2 weeks so they could sterilize it, I think all of that is consistent with an accident. But again, you can never close off your mind to every possibility, but I think the evidence points to it being an accident.
Next question. Just wait for a mic. Sorry, Gabby. Sorry. Great. Thanks, sir.
Hi, Sharri. Great book. A couple, if I may. You mentioned earlier that the Obama administration turned off gain-of-function research, but the book goes further, and it seems to infer that Fauci personally and unilaterally turns that funding back on as soon as the Obama administration have been moved on. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yes.
And the second question, also from the book, intriguingly, the book infers that China or the CCP go beyond denial and actually use their advanced knowledge of the impending pandemic to stockpile PPE, ventilators, and pharmaceuticals. I'd love to hear more about that if you can.
Yes, exactly. So, I had access amazingly to very senior people in the Trump administration when I was writing the book. And I thought it was important to do those interviews. One, because I wanted to know what the intelligence said, what else wasn't public. And some of that I then reported. I didn't wait for the book. I reported it straight away. For example, the Wuhan Institute of Virology workers who were hospitalized. But also I wanted to find out why they did lift that ban on gain of function. And, I think my view is, which I did in the book, I just factually detail how that happened, but my view is that Fauci just took advantage of the chaos in the administration to push to overturn this ban that had been in place since 2014. And no one knew he was doing it. No one even knew what gain of function was until it started being reported in the media. I interviewed, for example, his own boss, the health secretary, Alex Azar, and he didn't know the ban had been overturned. So this was something that happened, I found out it was a meeting at the White House. It was the Office of Science, Technology and Policy, and Fauci had this ban overturned, and I got the official statements from the time when that happened. But no one, it was just, I guess, a chaotic administration. And so he pushed this through. As I've already said, it was something he'd been advocating for a long time. And he was in personal contact with some of the scientists that engaged in that sort of research, which, by the way, does have some, can be used for some beneficial purposes. But it is also obviously highly dangerous because it creates these new deadly viruses that never existed in nature before. And then the second question, yes, such a good point. And I should have said that in my answer before when we were talking about the other Hamish McDonald. Yet not only was there a massive cover-up, but China was taking, was benefiting from this, right? stockpiled medicines while denying the virus was capable of human-to-human transmission. It was, a story I just wrote recently that wasn't in the book. It was buying up PCR machines in 2019. It's just extraordinary. And then even it's, used it to exert its aggression in our region as well, and not just in retaliation, but starting to make moves on Taiwan. Took advantage of the weaknesses that others were suffering. So yes, not just covering up, but a deliberate decision to benefit from it and to make others suffer. Yeah. Well, the cover-up was deliberate. I think the virus was accidental, but then the cover-up was of course very much deliberate. They chose to cover it up. They chose to not tell us. Yeah, absolutely.
We'll get another question, but following on from this general subject, some might ask, does it really matter whether it came from an animal or whether it was leaked via lab? And the argument is the Americans and their allies are not going to punish China by, say, demanding compensation for global suffering and death. So does it really matter either way?
I find it so astonishing when I hear this. I mean, you think if there is one missing child or the murder of one woman, there's all massive police investigations, homicide investigations to find out what happened. We've had 5 million people die. We need justice. We need to know the truth. And secondly, we need to know because we need to prevent the next pandemic. Yep. And if this was a result, and as I say, we don't know definitively, but if it was a result of a laboratory leak, then that's going to lead to a whole lot of different policy discussions, which I can't answer, about whether we should be funding research in China in laboratories where we have no oversight. That's a big question. We've just been funding this and accepting that China isn't transparent. And also questions about the security and safety protocols in laboratories as well.
Next question.
Sharri, you just tapped into what I was going to say about the next pandemic. If the Sinovac, which has been rolled out in Thailand, with some contention because of the low efficacy rate, what's the next step if that is only, let's say, at best 50% efficient, but that means it's also 50% ineffective? What's the next step, the next Wuhan derivative, if you are rolling out the slightly less effective Chinese and Russian-developed vaccines? What's the next step? I
actually haven't. I deliberately didn't investigate the vaccines because it was just a whole another complicated thing. So I didn't investigate the vaccines, but I think there is a lot of evidence, as you say, that the Chinese vaccines are not protecting. They're using it as part of vaccine diplomacy. It used to be mask diplomacy, and there's a lot of evidence that they're not effective. But I didn't drill down.
It's a very good question.
Would you consider a sequel to the book?
Yeah. China, People's Republic of China has a net zero COVID, not net zero, net zero emissions.
COVID zero.
COVID zero policy. The difference between China and Australia and New Zealand, who also have COVID zero.
Did you see the report today that somewhere's just gone back into lockdown?
Absolutely,
in China?
that's my point.
Yeah.
So, Australia and New Zealand, we've had COVID zero policies as well, but we're in a much better position because the vaccines here are more effective, but the Chinese aren't using as effective vaccines. So things could get worse in the mainland while the rest of the world recovers from this pandemic. I think we've got time for at least one more question. Yes, over there.
Sharri, my name's Chris White. It appears to me that with the CCP the way they are, the buggers are never, ever going to admit that it was an accident from the lab, short of a whistleblower who defects to the West. What are your thoughts about the possibility of absolute confirmation?
I think there have been already whistleblowers, and you probably saw my question to Trump on that, and he said, I would like to talk about that. I know I want to. And I think there have been already people they've spoken to. There are definitely people on US soil who used to work at the Wuhan Institute of Virology at that time. I didn't name them in the book because I didn't want them to be harassed or approached by other journalists. But I think that's already happened. And I think we will definitively know. I don't rule out China admitting it. And some people say that this could play into the political power plays with Xi Jinping and his rivals as well. So, I think that could be a scenario where there's an admission.
Next question. Yes.
As President Donald Trump withdrew funding from WHO because he said it was corrupt and exonerating the CCP on every level. Has that changed, do you know? Has Biden reinstituted?
Yeah, I think, yes, America did rejoin the WHO. I can't remember the funding
what is your thoughts
commitment.
What is your thought on that?
Well, it's a tricky thing, right? It's like the United Nations Human Rights Council. It's the same question. These bodies, there is corruption in these bodies and they are biased and they are ineffective. And the question is it better to be part of them and try and influence the discussion or just withdraw? I think, that there was good reason for US and Australia and others to be angry. The US chose to withdraw. Australia had the same view. Maurice Payne had the same view of how ineffective the WHO had been. And remember, Australia said this was a pandemic something like 2 weeks before the WHO did. But, Australia chose to stay. I think what was interesting, though, is the anecdote about when Trump did that in my book, that he just decided his speech in the Rose Garden that day was going to be a bit meh, so he decided to withdraw from the WHO, and it came as a shock to Andrew Bremberg, who was the United States ambassador to Geneva. He didn't even know it was happening that day. It was just so unplanned. But yes, obviously I am extremely highly critical of the WHO. Its only job is to protect us from a pandemic, and it categorically failed to do that. And it spread misinformation by saying the virus wasn't transmissible, by objecting to the travel bans that we all introduced. So yeah.
Well, I think that's right. I think when Donald Trump imposed the travel ban on China, the WHO criticised Trump.
Yeah, did. And Australia, said there were no need for travel bans.
Indeed. One more question, anyone? G'day, John.
I may have misread it, but somewhere in your book, I got a hint of some sort that there was a suspicion that some of the research that's being conducted in these laboratories in China, and probably elsewhere, has to do, or could have to do, with the development of viruses which were genetically selective. In other words, viruses for which one section of the human race would be more susceptible than others. Is that correct?
So when I was researching the book, we found a document from 2011. So it was China's official submission to the United Nations Biological Weapons Convention from 2011. And the convention's only held every 5 years, and in their 2016 convention, China submitted a very pared back submission. So this was their last detailed submission. And in that submission, they talk about exactly that. So they don't admit they're doing it, but they say this is a concern. These are the research developments in viruses that can target specific races. And I remember so clearly the day we eventually got that document, because Miles Yu, who was Pompeo's chief policy advisor, had told me about it, but he hadn't been able to get that document. So I asked my research team, and one of them is Liam Mendes, who's sitting at the back of the room. We went searching for this document, and a researcher based in the UK managed to find it in the back annals of the United Nations website. And you can see how many people had ever downloaded it. It was something like 3 or 4 people, and it had never been reported on before. And it was just breathtaking, because they were talking. Official Chinese government submission talking about, manipulating viruses and creating viruses so that they can target specific races. It's just despicable. And in that document as well, they spoke about man-made pathogens and that they could pose a latent threat to mankind. They spoke about the possibility of laboratory accidents. It was the most extraordinary document I've ever read in my life, and probably will ever read. And yet, what happened? No one was paying attention to what China's own documents were talking about. However, there was no admission in that document that they were doing it, right? This is just what they were discussing. And there's no evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was kind of doing that research, if that makes sense. But still, even the discussion of it in an official Chinese government submission is scary.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if the origin of COVID-19 is a mystery, so has been the reluctance to entertain the possibility that it may have originated from a lab in Wuhan. One of our favourite quotes, or my favourite quotes, is from Walter Lippmann, the distinguished public intellectual of the 20th century America, who once said that where all think alike, no one thinks very much. And you could apply that logic to the intoxicating media, political, scientific consensus throughout the course of 2020 that categorically ruled out the idea that the virus could come from a Wuhan lab. We still don't know for sure the origins of COVID, and it's quite conceivable we may never know. However, tonight we've heard a very sound assessment of, in Sharri's view, what really happened in Wuhan. Please join me in thanking Sharri.
Thank you for being such a supportive and engaging audience and for supporting my work as well. So I really appreciate it. And thank you to Tom for your help in the past year and also for this wonderful event.
Always.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Sharri. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.